So the next thing that ChatGPT does is it's going to create another function that is going to update the duration display. And by updating the duration display, it is simply performing this action. And now when it calls this function later in the code, this is what's going to happen. So very simple when it comes to the different parts of the function. The keyword function is used first, and then the function is named, and anything that needs to be passed into the function, any arguments, would go in between the parentheses. And in this case, we don't have any arguments. And then whatever actions the function will do are in between the opening and closing curly braces. So here, ChatGPT is basically creating these processes and bundling them up into functions so that later in the code, ChatGPT can then use or call those functions very quickly to have the program executed. And here again, this is the function that actually handles the decreasing of the timer length. So this function will decrement based on the duration. So basically, at some point, there will be something which will trigger the function, the timer, to decrease in time. And that event will probably be the click of a button. However, regardless to what triggers this, there needs to be a decrease in the time. So the time needs to slowly drop down. And here is where it's telling, it is creating that process of decreasing the time. And that's the decrement. And then here is the function for incrementing the duration. So this is actually controlling how long you want the time to be. So I guess the actual button would not be start, but it would be the plus button. So when you click on the plus button, it's going to expand how long the timer will run. And so the next function is the start timer function. So here's the start timer function, and this function basically is what would be triggered when the start button is clicked. So it first runs this start timer function, and we have the start button disabled, set to true. So basically, when the start timer function is triggered, the first thing that it needs to do is to disable the start button, and that's why this has been set to true. And it also needs to disable the minus button and the plus button. So these three buttons will no longer be able to be activated. And then the next thing that it'll do is it will make sure that the stop button can be activated. Now, when we were talking about data types, one of the data types was a Boolean. And these are all examples of Booleans because they can either be true or false. And so here's an example of how ChatGPT will use this specific data type. And then the next thing that it does is it sets the timer interval. And in order for this portion to happen, it will need to update the display. And here is an example of a conditional statement that ChatGPT has created. And it basically says that if the duration is equal to 0, meaning if the timer is at 0, then it should clear out the timer. A bell should play. Go ahead and bring this over. So, and the element that has the meditation timer ID should also blink. So here, all three, and when that happens, all three of these buttons are then disabled. Start button, the minus button, and the plus button are not disabled at that point. So they will be able to be clicked, and the stop button at that point will not be able to be clicked. So the exact opposite of what happens when the timer is first started. Next, it creates a function to stop the timer. And again, inside of the function is basically what is going to happen when the function is triggered. So with the stop function, it's going to start by clearing the interval function, and then it will reset the timer length and enable the plus and minus buttons again. So here, these plus and minus buttons are then no longer disabled, and the stop button at this point is disabled, and it now makes it blink, and then at the end it will make it stop blinking. So the timer will start blinking and then stop blinking here at the end. All right, and at the very bottom is where it is now basically calling everything that has been created. So it adds these event listeners to all of the buttons, and there's only 4 buttons. And it says that when these buttons are clicked, here's the click trigger. When they are clicked, then these are the things that should happen. So here we have the decrement duration function that is called, and it was created up here. So the decrement duration was created here, and at the very bottom, after it's created all of the functions, that is when it will determine how this function will be triggered. So what will cause this function to be triggered will be the click of the minus button. And the same thing for the plus button. When the plus button is clicked, the increment duration function will be triggered, meaning it will start at the very top of the function. Here it is. It'll start here. It'll do this first line, and then it'll do the second line. And the same thing for the start button and the stop button. So we're now going to copy this code. And again, in all actuality, once we have created the CSS and the JavaScript, or excuse me, the CSS and the HTML, ChatGPT does this for you. But again, it is very important that you have some basic knowledge of coding in order to use ChatGPT to create applications. So you do need to understand what's happening inside of the functions, just in case something does not work as planned. So we already have our HTML and our CSS, and at this point I'm just going to copy the JavaScript, and we will take this over into our application. All right, so let's head over to code pen. And here, so we're now over in CodePen, and we're just going to paste the code that we have copied. We'll go ahead and save it. We'll click Start, and just like the function request or the function has stated, when we click Start, the plus and minus buttons are then disabled, and so is the start button. So at that point, here we go. So when we click Start, the start button, the minus button, the plus button are all disabled. The only thing we can do is click the stop button. The other thing that happens when we click Start is the timer set interval is at that point started as well. So the duration of the timer now starts to update, and when it gets to 0, then here is everything that will happen. And in addition to this, all of the buttons will then be enabled again, but the stop button will be disabled. So we can go ahead and click now the stop button, and we'll notice that when the stop button is clicked, the clear timer interval function is first, and then the meditation timer element is called. So the meditation timer element up here in the HTML, here is the meditation timer. So that means that is this element is then called, and it will then begin to blink, which is what is set up in the CSS. So within the CSS, this blink animation will take place, and that is what it has been added here at the end. And also you'll notice that the start button is disabled, the minus button, or the start, minus, and plus buttons are all now enabled, and the stop button is disabled. Let's go ahead and click stop. And now let's test out the decrement function. This will also let us test out the blinking aspect of the stop timer function. So let's go up to the decrement. Here it is. And so this is basically what will happen when you click the minus button. So it will decrease the duration by 60. And this is basically the 60 seconds, because up here we've already determined that this is going to be done in 60 seconds. So when you decrease, we are taking off 60 seconds the time. And then when we increase, we are adding 60 seconds to the time and updating the display. So these buttons work well. And now let's go ahead and click start and just let it count down until it gets to 0. And that will be when we're able to test out the blinking portion. So if it does not blink, then we will know that there's a problem either here or within the CSS, which is here. Well, all of this is what causes it to blink, and it's blinking. So everything on our meditation timer has worked out well, and I think it would be great for us to go ahead and drop this over into our website as a tool that can be used and become a part of our service. So this was the activity that covered data types. We talked about booleans here. We're using integers when we're talking about seconds. And we could, let's see, we actually used some strings as well. Let me see if we used any strings. Not in JavaScript, we don't have any strings that were used. So we also talked about conditional statements. So here is a conditional statement. We also talked about functions, and there were several functions that were created in this activity. So I hope this gave you a little bit more of understanding when it comes to applying the knowledge of basic concepts when it comes to programming. And next, we will go back over to the lecture and see what's next.